Namaskar and good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all once again to this hall, which is actually identified with our Vimarsh talks in particular. So I think we are only after more than 2 years that we first Vimarsh after we have reopened, and first Vimarsh in 2 years that we are holding in a hybrid mode. Uh, the COVID, of course, disrupted our monthly lecture series, which, as you know, is one of our flagship programs. It's been going on since its inception, the VIF's inception, and some of the most prominent people, thinkers, experts, academics, diplomats, veterans, serving officials, and many other people have over the years addressed the public from this forum, and we regard this as one of our most important activities. And today I have a great pleasure in welcoming a dear friend, colleague, and distinguished fellow at the VIF, Mr. Ashok Kant, Ambassador Ashok Kant, who all of you here know him very well. He's been associated with VIF activities on a regular basis. But apart from that, he is a well-known figure. He heads the Institute for Chinese Studies for several years now, has been our ambassador in China, has also been High Commissioner to Malaysia, and he has served at in different capacities in several missions, and also he was a Consul General in Hong Kong. Also served in Washington. Been a Joint Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, dealing with the East Asia. Of course, I forgot Sri Lanka, where he was at I think around 2010 to 12 or 4 years he was there, a post LTT phase there, and he laid the foundation of the reconstruction of Sri Lanka, in which India had played a big role and continues to do so. He's a man of many parts, somewhat understated, but those of you who have heard him, he's very deep, and I think the analysis and the recommendations that he brings forward are very well thought, very balanced, and all of us benefit from his expertise. He has been part of our China discussions for many years. He heads our China discussion group and has conducted it extremely well. And once again, I think contributed to our enhanced understanding of China. So, Ashok, I'm very grateful to you for being with us today. Today, Ambassador Kantha is going to talk about China challenge in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. I think the title is deliberately worded to put Ukraine as a reference point, the Ukraine-Russia conflict that is going on, because as you all know, we've had numerous discussions in the VIF. We feel that Ukraine, just like COVID, is a turning point in international relations, and the impact will be long felt. And there is already a lot of restructuring, reorientation of policies. The great power rivalries are back. The world is looking at actually, it has transited to perhaps a new phase. And in this great transition that is underway, and it may take a long time, China is going to play a very big role. Of course, the Chinese policies have been discussed very often, but how China has seen the Ukraine challenge and how Ukraine is impacting its thinking and how China might position itself to take benefit or derive benefit from this crisis. We are seeing that Russia is coming closer to China. Russia's dependence on China is increasing, but our Russia-China relationship without problems? What impact Russia-China coming together will have on India and on the region? We're also seeing how the Quad is. We had a recent summit in Tokyo, the Quad summit, and people are looking for clues as to whether Ukraine crisis has impacted the Quad member countries. There was this fear whether the US focus on or involvement with the Ukraine crisis will take the focus away from Indo-Pacific, and in which, of course, China is very important. So I think these are the questions which are still being discussed. But in all this, how China positions itself, that is something that we would like to understand. So with these words, once again, a warm welcome, Ashok, and you could perhaps speak for about 45 minutes or so, then we will have a Q&A session.
Thank you, Arvind, for that very generous introduction. And thanks also for inviting me to deliver this Vimarsh talk. I'm quite familiar with Vimarsh and its importance in BIF. I'm particularly happy that I'm involved with it when this process is being resumed after a gap of more than 2 years. As Arvind mentioned, today I'll be talking about the China challenge in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, and I'll try to address many of the questions that Dr. Gupta just raised, and maybe some of the questions can come up later during Q&A session. Essentially, I will look at the China challenge from an Indian perspective and how India-China relations are being affected by the Ukraine crisis. You're all aware of the current state of India-China relations, how it's going through a very rough patch, how we are at low ebb in the relationship, especially since May 2020. One question that we need to address is how did we reach this kind of nadir in relationship so soon after Prime Minister Modi had his informal summit with President Xi Jinping at the Chennai Mamlapuram in October 2019. Arvind referred to my stint in Beijing as ambassador. I recall during the period 2014-16 when I was assigned to China, there was hope and possibility in the relationship between India and China, something which has simply evaporated in recent years. I recall when I was there, we were exploring new areas of cooperation. We were seeking to develop a positive agenda for engagement, even while we were fully mindful of the fact that China is, for us, our number one strategic challenge. Despite numerous difficulties in the relationship, you'd recall that Prime Minister hosted President Xi Jinping in Ahmedabad in September 2014. And as part of this hometown diplomacy, next year in May 2015, President Xi hosted Prime Minister Modi. And then there was a process of informal summits I referred to. There was a very serious dialogue at that time on how to forge a closer developmental partnership, how to manage simultaneous re-emergence of India and China as major powers. Of course, we had setbacks like the Chinese intrusions in Depsang in 2013, in Demchok and Chumar in 2014, and in Doklam in 2017, but these were resolved. Now, the trigger point for a major downturn in relations, as you are aware, uh, was the unexplained amassing of troops by China in the Western sector since early 2020. The efforts to unilaterally change the status quo at multiple points uh, along a line of actual control with China, and deadly clashes just over 2 years ago on the night of 15th, 16th June 2020. These developments have dramatically reshaped our perceptions about China and India. And one can even say in China about India. You would recall there was a survey conducted by ORF middle of last year on the Indian youth and the world. And one of the takeaways of the survey was that China was the most distrusted country, with 77% respondents regarding China as the country you could trust the least, while an equal percentage, 77%, assessed the USA as the most trusted country. And these feelings have been reciprocated on the Chinese side. In March this year, just 3 months ago, a couple of Central European, East European institutes conducted a survey in China, and they found that the USA was the least liked country in China, followed by India and Japan thereafter. Whereas Russia was the most liked country, though it happened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, followed by Pakistan. These are the mindset on both sides we need to bear in mind. Now, beginning April 2020, there has been what the outgoing Army Chief General M.M. Narwane described as a paradigm shift in force posturing in eastern Ladakh. You would recall that until April 2020, there were just about 8,000 Chinese troops opposite eastern Ladakh. The number suddenly went up to 60,000. And there was counter deployment by us in the western sector. You're aware of the talks which have taken place through political channels, diplomatic and military platforms. There has been limited progress in terms of disengagement along the friction points, so-called friction points. We still have situation of close proximity at some friction points, and there has been no breakthrough as far as de-escalation of troops, Indian and Chinese, in the Western sector is concerned. Now, the first point I would like to highlight here, before we come to Ukraine, is that the nature of India-China borders has undergone a qualitative change. The LAC has become live and dangerous. The Chinese have stepped up infrastructure building in border areas, and we have reciprocated. But the infrastructure gap between India and China, I suspect, is still growing. We have not been able to bridge that gap. You're aware of recent reports about China constructing a second bridge across Pankung Lake. Very major. There was a report on how China has upgraded its airfields and relevant air power assets in both Tibet and Xinjiang, development of so-called Shaohang or wellness villages very close to LAC, and series of other measures China has taken, essentially with the objective of entrenching its long-term presence in the immediate proximity of the line of actual control in the Western sector in particular, though also to lesser extent in middle and eastern sectors. So Chinese are entrenching themselves, and the likelihood of status quo ante as of April 2020 being restored, to my mind, is somewhat low at this point of time. The Indian side, as you know, has made it clear that they cannot be returned to business as usual or normal dealings with China unless peace and tranquility is restored in border areas. China, on the other hand, has argued that let's compartmentalize the border issue and develop relations elsewhere, which is not acceptable to us. And this message was conveyed very clearly when Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited India on 25th March earlier this year. Let me, however, clarify here that while the trigger point for downturn of relations was what happened in Eastern Ladakh since May last year, May 2020, we have, several structural factors behind a reappraisal by India of the China challenge. So this is not something which has happened over last 2 years or so. What are these structural challenges? Uh, One problem, of course, is that the basic paradigm managing, governing relations between India and China, which had been in place since December 1988. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China has broken down, and we don't have an alternative in place. We have problems on a host of issues, including the boundary question, trade imbalance, growing footprint of China in our neighborhood, both land and maritime, and China's aggressive behavior and its complete disinclination to respond to India's concerns, interests, and aspirations. Increasingly, China has tended to look at India through the prism of its strategic rivalry with USA. And amidst these changes, there's one factor which is constant. That is China's refusal to accept India as an equal. Now, the boundary question has once again moved back to the center stage in India-China relations. The LAC, which was largely peaceful, has become live, as we saw earlier, and differences in LAC are increasingly being defined by China in terms of sovereignty, which is very different from the position they had taken earlier when we talked about mutual perceptions of LAC. I recall, Arvind referred to my days as Joint Secretary East Asia. I was closely involved in negotiating the agreement on political parameters and guiding principles for boundary settlement in April 2005. We managed to work out a good framework with substantive, concessions by China, including on the question of settled population, which was very important for us. But since then, China has reinterpreted those provisions and essentially walked back on commitments they had given to us in 2005. So therefore, I don't see any prospect of early boundary settlement with China. And likewise, as we discussed earlier, peace and tranquility, which was one of the major achievements of India and China, the relationship has also broken down since early 2020. Now, this problem is compounded by differing strategic perceptions and worldviews of India and China. I referred to the fact that China doesn't regard India as an equal partner. Indeed, China looks at the global order and the Asia-Pacific order in hierarchical terms, where it's either at the apex or hopes to be at the apex in future. And they would like India to accept a subsidiary position. In private discussions, they remind us that Chinese GDP is 5 times the size of Indian GDP. And why should we expect that China will treat us as an equal player? There are, as Arvind referred to, deep differences on constructs like Quad and Indo-Pacific. And Chinese position on these issues has evolved. For instance, on Quad, when it was revived first about 5 years ago, they were rather dismissive of it. In fact, Foreign Minister Wang Yi described Quad as so much of sea foam on the ocean waters, which will dissipate soon. But since then, they have started looking at Quad as a strategic challenge to China. I would here, in particular, like to recall remarks made by then Vice Foreign Minister Liu Cheng, who was also Chinese ambassador to India earlier, when he compared developments in Europe with reference to the Ukraine crisis with what was happening in Indo-Pacific. He equated eastward expansion NATO with arrangements like AUKUS and Quad. He warned of Asia-Pacific falling into abyss as a result of these developments. And he argued that the real goal of Indo-Pacific strategy is to establish an Indo-Pacific version of NATO. So this is how the Chinese are looking at uh, developments like Quad, in which we are closely and heavily invested. Now, the China challenge faced by us is aggravated by the asymmetry between India and China in terms of economic, military, and technological capabilities, to which I made a reference earlier. And it's a double whammy for us. On one side, our gap with China is expanding. On the other hand, China's capability gap with US is shrinking. And this is particularly the case since the global economic crisis 2007-8, when the Chinese made this assessment that the West is in terminal decline and China's moment has arrived. And they started adopting a more assertive policy. What Xi Jinping did in 2012 after he came to power was not really start a new policy, but the existing trends were accelerated. He sort of doubled down on China's aggressive behavior. Under these circumstances, China is not at all inclined to accommodate vital interests of India and immediate neighborhood and in the Indian Ocean region. Likewise, it's not willing to take on board India's aspirations on issues like our membership of UN Security Council or membership of Nuclear Suppliers Group, issues on which they had shown a considerable flexibility in the past. I recall 2005 when Premier Vanchapa visited India privately. He assured us that they will be supportive of India's interest in joining UN Security Council as a permanent member, and that at least they will not be obstructing that process. But today, China is the number one obstacle. In 2008, they were they didn't, despite the reservations, they didn't, come in the way of our nuclear agreement with USA being operationalized. But today they are proactively sabotaging any prospect of India joining NSG. What I'm trying to point out that there has been marked shift in Chinese position. There has been a rethinking in India as well. Let's acknowledge that fact. I referred to our efforts to forge a closer developmental partnership with China. I recall that when Prime Minister Modi visited, we made a strong pitch for Chinese investment in India. And we did get good investment from China after that. But since then, and especially since the Galwan crisis, we have come to the conclusion that it's in our interest to reduce economic dependence on China, given the fact that China is our primary strategic challenge, and also a country which has a track record of weaponizing economic interdependence. You see what's doing vis-a-vis Australia, for instance. Mindful of these realities, India has sought to curtail economic dependence on China through various measures. In fact, it started happening even before standoff in Eastern Ladakh surfaced in May 2020. In April 2020, China was investment from China, all investment from China, whether direct or indirect, was put on prior approval list. And thereafter, investment flows have fallen drastically. In 2 years, up to March 2022, total FDI inflows from China is less than $70 million. And in other areas as well, we took initiative. We are aware of the fact that more than 275 Chinese apps were prohibited after Galwan. Impact of these two measures on FDI and apps has on the whole been positive, because there has not been any significant negative impact on FDI inflows from other sources. They were concerned that startups in India, which had come to depend on Chinese investment, will suffer. But that didn't happen. Apps alternatives came up very quickly, so we didn't quite pay a price for these decisions. Likewise, we tried to sort of recalibrate our imports from China. Here, I would like to recall a study which was made by Confederation Indian Industry in 2020, based on data of 2019, and it found that there were 1619 items at HS6 digit level, where share of India's imports from China was between 25% and 75%, and as many as 578 products where share was more than 75%. Very heavy dependence on imports from China. And among the top three import categories last year, 2021-22, 48% electronics, 39% of machinery, and 44% organic chemicals came from China. So that the high dependence on China for imports, including in critical sectors, unfortunately remains unchanged. So we have not been able to make a dent as far as that problem is concerned. Now let me move to the Ukraine crisis and how it's directly impacting our perception of China challenge, India-China relations, as well as broader geopolitical context in which this relationship is being managed. Uh, as Dr. Arvind Gupta rightly pointed out, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a turning point. It has affected the European theater in particular in a very fundamental way. NATO has been reinvigorated. The transatlantic alliance has been reinforced. There has been a sea change in Germany's defense policy, for instance. I'm just giving some example without going to detail. The unprecedented nature of the US-led sanctions against Russia reflects the Western unity. But my submission is that while the changes in the European theater are very fundamental, as far as Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific is concerned, so far the changes are less pronounced. There is, of course, a major economic fallout in terms of shortages and higher prices of energy resources, uh, fertilizers, grain and commodities, and supply chain disruptions, and headwinds for global economy, which was already passing through a difficult period before the Russian action against Ukraine. However, what is happening in Europe has not fundamentally altered the basic geopolitical dynamics of Asia Pacific region. And this is the point which Minister of External Affairs Dr. Jaishankar has made on several occasions, that Europe should not look at the world through a Eurocentric prism, because there are other concerns and preoccupations when it comes to Asia Pacific region. So what are the trends? What are the trends in Asia Pacific region which remain unchanged? One primary trend was US-China strategic competition, and this is unlikely to abate. This trend will continue and perhaps get reinforced. There were concerns that as the USA gets preoccupied with the European theater, it will sort of take its eyes off the Asian theater. But so far that hasn't happened. So USA is able to remain involved in Asia Pacific, Indo Pacific as well. And as evidence, one can refer to the recent visit of President Joe Biden to Asia, and the messages and signals that emanated during the visit, including the Quad Summit, which took place in Tokyo. On China, the Quad nations were on the same page, notwithstanding the differences on Russia. Without naming China, Quad leaders clearly conveyed that they will strongly oppose coercive, provocative, and unilateral actions by China that seek to change the status quo and heighten tensions across the region, including through militarization disputed territories, dangerous use of Coast Guard vessels, and maritime militia, and attempts to disrupt other nations' offshore resource exploitation activities. Now, China is not referred to, but it's very clear that what's the target of this statement. Uh, Subsequently, on 26th May, in an important policy statement on China delivered at George Washington University, US Secretary of State Tony Blinken stated categorically that even while Russia waged a war in Ukraine, China posed the most serious long-term challenge to the international order. So this basic, assessment on part of the USA that China is the primary challenge has not changed, and we may expect that Asia will remain the main theater of geopolitical contestation, despite the escalation of conflict in Europe. We may see, as Dr. Gupta mentioned, intensification uh, strategic linkages between China and Russia. But the fact remains that these linkages were already very strong even prior to Russian invasion of Ukraine. We should recall that the famous joint statement of 4th February during President Putin's visit to China, which talked about a partnership without limits between China and Russia, predated Russian invasion of Ukraine by 20 days. At the same time, uh, this is a relationship which will get intensified with significant implications for us, which we can discuss perhaps in greater detail during Q&A session. But there are also no contradictions when it comes to relations between China and Russia. Whether over a longer period, Russia will continue to accept a junior partner's role, allow China to sort of, ingress into their shared periphery, particularly Central Asian region. That's something which will bear close monitoring. Now, China, I'll suggest, has come under greater pressure in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis. This is contrary to assessment made by some people that China is going through a sort of period of opportunity, greater opportunity post-Ukraine. My own observation is that, as Chinese scholar Yan Xuetong observed in an important article in Foreign Affairs in early May, China today is placed in strategic predicament as a result of the Ukraine crisis. It's professing to adopt a middle path, but in reality, it has doubled down on its investment in relations with Russia. It's blaming the West for the origins of the war in Ukraine, including through the eastward expansion of NATO. And the Chinese position on this issue has heightened its tensions with both USA and EU. The perception of enhanced threat from Russia also means that there is less patience in the USA and Europe to countenance China's perceived alliance with Russia. So bottom line is that China actually is facing an awkward position post-Ukraine. Now, another issue which has been discussed at length is what Russian action in Ukraine means in terms of China's plans vis-a-vis Taiwan, especially its objective of unifying Taiwan through forcible means if required. You're aware that an important speech to Taiwanese diaspora delivered in 2019, President Xi Jinping projected unification of Taiwan as a necessary requirement for the great rejuvenation of Chinese nation, which must be achieved before 2049, which is centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. In my own assessment, China is not yet ready to forcibly annex Taiwan, and perhaps the timeline for military operations directed against Taiwan will be pushed back a little as a result of lessons learned by China from Ukraine, except under the unlikely scenario of unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan, when China will feel compelled to intervene militarily, notwithstanding the cost involved. The lessons learned from Ukraine may also encourage China to accelerate the process of its military modernization and restructuring, which has made huge headway, especially last decade since Xi Jinping came to power. Likewise, China will step up its ongoing efforts to hardwire the Chinese economy against the kind of economic and financial sanctions the USA and the European Union are deploying to weaken Russia. China is deriving its lessons from Russia's predicament, and it is taking steps to sort of, reduce the leverage the West has vis-a-vis China. In effect, this will lead to the process of selective decoupling, which was already unfolding, being accelerated somewhat. Though, given China's integration in the global marketplace, it's very difficult to have a large economic decoupling, large-scale economic decoupling between China and the West. Uh, I would suggest that recent developments linked to Ukraine have not fundamentally altered the challenges we face vis-a-vis China. Earlier, I referred to Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to India on 25th March. One can argue that one of the motives behind that visit was to explore if China can drive a wedge between India and the USA. I believe that China might be somewhat less confrontational towards us, but this will be tactical shift. As far as China's policy towards India is concerned, I don't expect any fundamental change taking place in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis. You would have seen that just a few days ago, China blocked a joint move by India and the US to designate Lashkar-e-Toiba deputy head Abdul Rahman Makki as a global terrorist at the UN Security Council. This is just an example. I think this track record will be maintained by China. Likewise, no, despite the differences with India on Russia, we may expect USA, Japan, and other like-minded countries to accommodate India's nuanced position in Ukraine, keeping in mind the broader geopolitical context, especially shared concerns vis-a-vis China. While there are some commonalities in positions taken by India and China on Ukraine, it will be in our interest to differentiate the stance of the two countries. And indeed, our positions are quite different. And the way West is looking at India's stance on Ukraine and China's stance on Ukraine, again, is very different. While strategic autonomy is desirable, we should not take our eye off the fact that China is our primary challenge, and differences with the USA and European countries and Russia need to be managed deftly without letting this issue become a major irritant in our relations with them. It's advisable to eschew the temptation of scoring debating points in public arguments with the West on Russia. Now, looking ahead, how do we deal with the China challenge? Let me offer some suggestions here. First, we must maintain the present position that there cannot be business as usual until peace and tranquility has been restored in the border areas. This is going to be a difficult proposition, but we should not lower our expectations in this regard. Therefore, I think we should continue to insist that normal patrolling by Indian troops in areas like Depsang Plains and Demchok be resumed as part of any disengagement and de-escalation package. We'll have to persevere, even if even if it takes time. We cannot accept the Chinese contention that border issue be set aside and we resume our normal relations in other areas. Two, we do not wish to have hostile relations with China, and therefore will have to manage defense of that country through a mix of dialogue and confidence building measures. Apart from continuing with the existing dialogue mechanisms, political, diplomatic, and military, we should consider launching a strategic dialogue with China where we can identify red lines in the relationship, because it's becoming an increasingly difficult and sensitive relationship, and also build guardrails how to avoid emergency situations, because you can't exclude the possibility of accidents taking place in India-China relation along India-China borders, especially when level of deployment of troops in close proximity is very high. There's another key question we need to address. Once we return to a relative peace and tranquility in border areas, do we revert to the policy of constructive engagement with China that existed prior to border standoff in Eastern Ladakh, or do we adopt a different policy? Frankly, given the fact that China is the largest neighbor, we have no alternative but to engage with China. But that engagement must be tempered by a heavy dose of realism and a clear understanding that China is for us the primary strategic challenge. Must consciously reduce our economic dependence on China and move away from China centric regional and global supply chains. This will be a long process of transition. It's not going to happen overnight, but our policy objectives should be defined clearly and a roadmap put in place for realizing those objectives. In this context, it's relevant to note that the Ukraine conflict has accelerated the trend of progressive shift away from China-centric supply chains to arrangements which are being described as more resilient or safer, even if they're less effective. So cost effectiveness has become a lesser consideration, and safety and security has become a higher consideration when it comes to global and regional value chains. Three, we need to continuously invest in building up deterrence to dissuade China from undertaking any misadventure against us. And frankly, this is the only guarantee we have that China will be honest in its dealings with us. Because if China sees an opening, it can take, even though the military action may be limited, but as it did in Eastern Ladakh in early 2020, and it has maintained its entrenched position since then. It can do so again, perhaps on a larger scale elsewhere, including in the eastern sector. So our future management of border with China should be predicated on our acknowledgement of this reality that we have a live border with China, that level of deployment has gone up, and that our going back to pre-April 2020 position is not all that likely in the foreseeable future. Four, we need to undertake domestic balancing vis-a-vis China by building up our economic and technological capabilities and social cohesion. Now, this will primarily involve indigenous effort, but we should also bear in mind that building up our economic and technological capability will require inputs from countries like USA, Japan, and EU nations, which are well disposed towards the rise of India. In their larger strategic thinking, India plays an important role. So, how to leverage that positive interest in India is something we have to constantly explore, considering that even though there has been relative decline in power dynamics, power matrix in these countries, they remain leading sources of capital and technology which we need for our economic growth. Let me suggest here that it's possible to bridge the capability gap with China over longer time horizon if we put our act together. The growth rate in China is coming down. This year, their GDP target is 5.5%, but by all accounts, they're unlikely to meet this target. They have made a number of serious mistakes in management economy in the recent past, including zero COVID policy, Xi Jinping's distinct preference for less productive state sector, his virtual onslaught against dynamic tech companies like Alibaba and Didi, uh, the debt overhang, end of demographic dividend, pressures from the USA and other Western countries. I know China had a sweet spot until 2008. That period is well behind it now. Uh, you know, West was helping China to grow, but today West is actively working to stymie growth of China. This is something Chinese keep complaining all the time. China's overweening ambitions, aggressive behavior, and hubris have engendered a countervailing coalition, which may get reinforced in the wake of the war in Ukraine. These circumstances provide an opening for us to close the capability gap that we have vis-a-vis China. 5, given the capability gap we have with China, we have pursued the policy of external balancing, working with the USA, EU, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and other like-minded countries which have shared concerns in respect of China's behavior and intention. I think internally we need to be quite clear about the fact that if China is 5 times our GDP, if the defense budget is 4 times our defense budget, you need to work with other partner countries. We need not be coy about it. We need not be circumspect about injecting a more prominent security component to Quad, for instance. I think some of these areas we need to be more forthcoming. 6, we should maintain our dealings with China in areas and forums which serve our interests. For instance, in plurilateral groupings like BRICS and SCO. So, Prime Minister, day after tomorrow, will be participating in the virtual BRICS summit. But we should avoid, high-level visits to China until the border situation has been addressed. And we should also be mindful of the fact that China is trying to dominate these plurilateral arrangements like BRICS and SCO, and use them as instruments in his strategic rivalry with the USA. I think this is something where we'll have to sort of see that how Chinese designs in this regard are thwarted. Finally, there is an urgent need for investing in understanding the China challenge in a holistic and multidisciplinary manner and from an Indian perspective. This will involve research focusing on history, culture, society, technology, and economy of China rather than dwelling primarily on strategic and security issues. I must mention that compared to our much better endowed Western partners, our track record of discerning trends in Chinese politics and China's external behavior has been reasonably good. Just to give an example, we never had any illusions that opening up of China, its economic modernization, its integration with the global economy will result in total opening up or democratization. We never had any such illusions in India as USA and European countries had. At the same time, the fact remains that there is a major deficit in China studies in India, as understanding of China remains shallow and far too dependent on Western sources. This is one area where two institutions I'm involved with, the Institute of Chinese Studies and Vivekananda International Foundation, can play an important role along with other partner institutions. I'll conclude here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you can do it from here, or you want to say one? So there we have a wonderful presentation full of insights coming from experience of dealing with China for such a long time, and also generally being participant in so many of India's initiatives towards China. So I think two or three points which are very important. One is that the point Mazda made is that perhaps the Western fascination with China might be over, and this is already beginning to show its impact on China. And if that happens and if that is sustained, that opens up a whole lot of opportunities for us. The second point is that China's behavior and attitude towards India is not going to change, and we should expect continued problems in India-China relations because of the several structural reasons that Ambassador Kantha pointed out. The third is that the Ukraine crisis is a turning point in the global politics, and some sort of reshaping or rebalancing of equations is taking place. Russia's coming close to China is a development which needs to be watched. But there are possibilities of problems in Russia-China relations because Russia will not accept a junior role for too long, and ultimately it will begin to assert. So that's why I think the corollary is that we must maintain reasonably good ties with Russia. That is, I think, very important, and that's why India's nuanced position on Ukraine needs to be seen in that context as well. And then I think Ambassador Kantha laid down a number of very important suggestions as to how we need to deal with China, particularly if China challenge is going to get even more serious for India. And Galwan was a manifestation of what had happened some years earlier in Depsang and before that in Chumar and so on. I mean, China had this double position. I mean, they continued to profess good relationship with India, a lot of exchange of visits, but the way they went back on the 2005 agreement and the way they have shown absolutely no interest in resolving India's the boundary problem, and of course showing any sensitivity to India's security concerns. So that is quite obvious. But I think Ukraine is going to make it even worse. And as was pointed out, that LSE has become live, and all the minor differences are now being talked about in terms of sovereignty disputes and so on. So that leaves India in a difficult position because China is a neighbor, but not in a hopeless condition, because both by internal and external balancing, as was pointed out, we can probably meet with the challenge. So now I'll open this for questions, comments. Kindly keep your comments brief, and we will take them one by one, and then Ambassador Kantha will respond. So we still have about half an hour, 35 minutes before we close. So the floor is now open. Yeah, I can't. Okay.